It was a very rural area, at least a day's ride from the nearest town. So people had to be very self-sufficient because they just couldn't pop into town and run to the store for something they needed. It took a different type of person to live in an area like this. The Great Smoky Mountains Heritage Center preserves Smoky Mountain history through artifacts and buildings. We have 17 historic structures as well as artifacts dating back 9,000 years up through the coming of the national park. I fell in love with history when I was a little kid, and it's because of the stories. And the older I've become, the more I realize that the same is true. It's all about the stories, and artifacts like Old Death help to tell those stories. When you hear about these larger-than-life characters, that's one thing, but when you can see a tangible object that was connected with that person, it really helps bring that story to life.
William Marion Walker, Black Bill Walker, was an individual who lived here in the Smoky Mountains in the Townsend area. And he was born in 1838 and died in 1919. He was first married right before the Civil War to Nancy Kaler and started a family there. Soon after the Civil War, he did marry two other ladies, Mary Ann Moore and Ma Stennett. He raised all of those families together, which is a little bit uncommon, but he considered himself of the Mormon sect, even though his father was a Presbyterian minister. So. Black Bill Walker was probably considered bigger than life today. Much of an iconic individual. He was a very large property owner and sold timber, but he did all kinds of things from raising bees to farming to helping raise a community, basically, related to many of the Walker families here in Walker Valley. One of the important things I think that he did was he left a legacy of family here that's remembered by the community. Old Death is the iconic rifle, along with the accoutrements that followed with the rifle, the powder horn, the powder measure, the bag, those sorts of things. The rifle Old Death was named Old Death because of bagging of game that he bagged, not necessarily individuals, but he was very astute and capable of taking game with that rifle, which he did. I think it was somewhere over 100 bears, painters or panthers, wildcats, and deer alike that he took with that rifle.
This is a muzzle-loading rifle. Everything that goes out the barrel has to go down the muzzle first. So, powder from the powder horn was poured in, measured precisely with a measure. And this measure made by William Walker with his initials. And after the powder goes down, in this case, that's a 58 caliber ball. And what you just witnessed was something that commonly occurred. This is not a flawless process. Anything can happen. So dropping a ball in the woods is a little more trouble than dropping it on a carpeted floor. But we know that this was the way of life then. Kentucky long rifle is a very easy to use firearm, but it takes a lot of little tools and accoutrements and a lot of practice to be proficient with. You have to remember, many of these rifles were built right on the frontier. I don't mean just barely across the mountains in Virginia in their day, but all the way into eastern Tennessee. And they were made from ore that was mined right here and forged and refined, and wood came right from the area in which they lived. Maple and walnut being the choice, but other fruit woods and hardwoods used.
Characteristics here and hardware. I mean, very crudely done. He's trying to really dress it up on a fancy rifle, but all of these pieces are copper instead of brass. You see how crudely they're made?
Anyone that moved this area from 1770s to 1825 was a pretty self-reliant person that was willing to risk everything to live the way they wanted to, and maybe to strike it rich. There was always chances of prospecting and finding gold or silver, and then there was also the whole opportunity of developing land and then reselling it. This was a real commercial activity then, and so this area attracted many people. Plus, it was the West then. It was the furthest west civilization of the day, and so that always has a lure for some people.
I was in one of our historic structures one day doing some living history, and a man walked in, asked to speak to me, and asked if I was familiar with Bill Walker and Old Death, and I said yes. And he said, well, I've got it. And at that point, it was a lost rifle. Nobody knew where it was. And as a curator, you tend to be really skeptical when you hear things like that. It's a bit like saying George Washington slept here. You want to say prove it. So he started telling the story of his grandfather, who actually had gone to Walker Valley as a fairly young child with his mother, and they were trapped due to the weather. It was snowing, and so they stayed with Bill and Nancy Walker that night. And Bill Walker spent the night telling this kid his famous hunting stories, his amazing hunting stories, and Old Death was hanging there above the fireplace. And the kid grew up, went to college in New York, started his career there, and was walking down the street one day and saw an advertisement for an auction of Black Bill Walker's items featuring Old Death. And he went to the auction and bought it, and it stayed in his family until it came to us 2 years ago. So without saying anything about the conversation from the man who claimed to have Old Death, I actually approached Randall and said, what do you know about what happened to Old Death? And he said, we don't know a whole lot except that we lose track of it somewhere in New York. And so that's kind of when my heart started pounding. I thought, okay, so there's at least a connection there. Somebody knows that one of Bill Walker's children took it to New York, and that is the last we hear of it. One of his sons took it to New York and sold it there. Once we actually received the rifle, we saw some of the other items were actually marked with Bill Walker's initials. He had carved them into some of the pieces that he had created. Also from looking at the photographs, the existing photographs of Old Death with Bill Walker actually holding it, we compared those with the rifle. All the measurements match. There are also stories that Bill Walker made the rifle, but it was also used at the Battle of Kings Mountain in the American Revolution. So once again, Ben and Randall came in handy because they noticed that the barrel itself is like the Revolutionary era, but everything else seemed to be from a later period, so likely made by Bill Walker. My impression of Black Bill Walker is that he helped some of his mythological status himself. He was quite the storyteller, and that's what makes it so fun. He's exceptional in the true sense of the word, and so that's what I love about folks like Bill Walker is he just has a lot of stories around him and made sure of that. So he made sure that he became this larger than life character.